Professor Eileen Murphy.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the Society for inviting me here today. I have to say, Jerry is somebody I've really enjoyed working with over the years. And Jerry also then is an expert in Edward Hinks and was a contributor to the Decapitated volume. So that's where we first met, as you said. And I'm really pleased that we're, fingers crossed, if we get the funding, going to be working together on our community archaeology and wellbeing project. So as Jerry said, tonight I'm going to talk a bit about life and death in medieval Ireland. So I thought I would give quite a broad overview of the types of information that we can find. And I suppose it's a bit self-indulgent, but I'm also going to sort of focus in on areas that I'm interested in. So we'll be, looking at things like pregnancy in the past, atypical burial practices. Then we'll just look at, things like everyday injuries and sort of osteoarthritis and, the things that people had to cope with as they went about their daily lives. And I'm going to finish by looking at trauma and violence. And as you'll see, we can see aspects of, good times of life, but then also very sort of dark times and lots of quite people who came to quite nasty ends. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about the scientific analysis of skeletons, because that's what I do. I'm a bioarchaeologist, so I focus on human skeletal remains, and my main objectives are to try to put flesh back onto the bones of skeletons, because those skeletons were once people, alive people, just like ourselves. So we want to, find out about things like health, diet, lifestyle, violence, emotion, religion, population movement, evolution of infectious disease, all of these different facets by looking at the remains of our ancestors. And we do realise as archaeologists that we're extremely privileged to be able to undertake this work. So I just want to briefly mention the ethics of the analysis that we do. So archaeologists, we only disturb the dead when we've got very good reason to do so. So the populations I'm talking about tonight have all been excavated in advance of development. So it's usually, there's a decision has been made that the needs of the living outweigh the needs of the dead. So we operate in a very highly regulated system. So anything that we do that's destructive or even disturbing the dead, it's undertaken under, a very sort of strict licensing system. Why do we do it? Well, we give a voice to the people of the past and we tell their stories. So if you think about the history books, they tend to concentrate on the great and the good, but archaeology can look at everybody. And that's why I really enjoy it. And I suppose it's why it's my passion. Also then, we cannot understand the present and prepare for the future if we do not learn from the past. And in terms of bioarchaeology, one of the things that we can do is look at diseases and their evolution, through work on pathogen aDNA, for example. And we've been living in a pandemic, so we know, what a big impact infectious diseases can have on people. So I think that's an area where we can make a real contribution to the good of the living. So I suppose people in the past, I think this is really important because sometimes I think, archaeology is very people-less, and I think that's completely wrong because all the sites, all the artifacts, all these wonderful things surrounding us, they were all made by people. So for me, archaeology has to have people in the middle. So I'm really interested in making a really noisy, kind of vibrant past. Let's see if that's going to work. Yeah, so this is my sound effects. So I'm interested in women, bringing all these voices in, because a lot of our early narratives were dominated by kind of, adult males of a particular sort of working age, and everybody else was forgotten about. So I think women, babies, migrants, the unborn even, elderly people, physically impaired, poor, teenagers, all these forgotten people, pregnant women, men, of course, as well, chronically diseased, children, LGBTQ plus, everybody should be in our narratives of the past. And that's what I try to do, and a lot of bioarchaeologists try to do. So I think the past should be a really noisy, hustly, bustly place full of all these different voices with no one kind of dominant narrative. So I'm going to focus mostly on two sites that I've studied quite recently, or over the last decade or so, Ranelagh and Ballyhanna. So these are both largely Gaelic medieval populations, and I just wanted to introduce them briefly. So I don't know if you can read the writing, but it's kind of there for me as well. So in terms of Ranelagh, this was one of these large road scheme projects. It's a site in County, just outside Roscommon town. And it was funded by Roscommon County Council and Transport Infrastructure Ireland. So altogether there's 557 individuals, 170 adults and 387 children. It was mostly in use from AD 600 to 1100, so it's largely early medieval in date. Most of the people on this site, had typical sort of Christian period burials. There were extended supine, which just means lying on their back with their arms and legs straight and their head to the west. This just shows you the plan of the Ranelagh burial site. So the purple bit, the purple sort of wedge shaped, is where the burials were. And you can see there's lots of kind of banks and ditches, and it seems to have been what we call a settlement cemetery. So there's like an area where the living would have used, and then there's the area for the dead. And this would have probably been, a cemetery that was used by probably the same community over and over the generations. So it might have been, part of a furta, which is part of a tuatha, which would be sort of a local group. So that's a briefly introduction to Ranelagh. Ballyhanna then, so this was another roads project, and it was funded by Donegal County Council and the National Roads Authority, which are now Transport Infrastructure Ireland. It's right up just outside the town of Ballyshannon. So again, in both cases, there were dangerous bends in the roads, and that's why the road schemes were undertaken. So you can see this is a plan of the Ballyhanna burial ground. There was both of these sites were completely forgotten about. It wasn't really until the archaeologists started excavating that they uncovered the cemeteries. You can see there's the remains of a church at Ballyhanna, which had also been forgotten. And it was very much a very small but very deep burial ground, whereas Ranelagh was quite a large sort of spread out burial ground, with less intercutting of burials. At Ballyhanna, the main burial phase was 1200 to 1650, so it's a later medieval site. There was almost 1,300 individuals buried here, nearly 900 adults and 427 children. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about those two sites, because I'm going to be talking about people from both of them quite throughout this talk. So basically, just to sort of give you as well an idea about, what does an archaeological population look like in one of these major cemeteries. So at Ranelagh, like I said, we had 557 individuals. So we had some unborn babies. You can see the little fetus here, still in its mother's womb. We had 191 babies altogether. So 196 children. So babies would be anybody under 1 year of age, and then children would be the 1 to 18-year-olds, and then 170 adults. So to us, that's a pretty shocking profile. We're used to, a much smaller proportion of children dying and, more adults. But for pre-industrial society, we do get very high levels of child death, particularly baby death. So it's a fairly standard kind of profile for an archaeological population. Okay, so I just want to focus then a little bit about death during pregnancy, because this was a project I undertook quite recently when I tried to sort of review the evidence for, women who had unborn babies, who were found together on archaeological sites. So I looked at 15 sites across Ireland and identified 30 potential maternal deaths. Now that seems like a lot, but when you sort of look at it as a proportion of the women of kind of childbearing age, it's only about 1.7%. So that's probably a gross underrepresentation. So just some of the examples you can see here. This is a full-term fetus, sort of in situ in utero, from Mount Gamble in County Dublin. So you can see the baby's wee head here. So that baby was ready to be born, but something happened that the delivery didn't progress. Over here we've got a case from Ballyhanna. So we've got a young woman who's only about 4'9", and she had 2 little babies. So there's what we call skeleton 979. There's this little head. And then skeleton 986, you probably can't really see it, but it's just up here. So there's a little bit of debate. I consider the babies to have been born and then the three of them to have died quite soon after the delivery and been sort of laid out, with the mother's arms around the babies. Some people have suggested that maybe they weren't actually born and that, this was just her enlarged abdomen. But I think the babies are too far apart for them to have still been in utero. But it just isn't. This example is it shows us really the dangers of twin pregnancies, which are still quite risky today. And we've got quite a number of sort of women buried with with twins or little twins on their own from archaeological sites. So it's kind of deliveries that didn't work out and cause the death of the children. This is just another example then from a site called Ballykilmore 6 in County Westmeath. So we have a possible case of shoulder dystocia, which is something again that happens for modern women but can be corrected. So you can see, if you look at the picture at the top, you can see the baby's head has been born. And then if you look inside the kind of pelvic area, that's the little scapula there. So it's not definite, but it's a possibility that the scapula was wedged against the mother's pelvis, and then that the birthing couldn't continue, and that the pair died because of that. So this is there. You can see the baby's head quite noticeably. Now, so we've got these very clear examples of death during pregnancy, but we have this underrepresentation, which is an issue. Now, it's possible that some of the maternal deaths are being hidden because of sort of caesarean practices. And we know from some of the historical sources that there was a practice called Postmortem caesarean. So it's one account is called the Battle of the Boyne in the Book of Lecan. So this was written between 1397 and 1418, but it's probably based on earlier events. And it talks about the unborn son of Ethna, who was the daughter of King Yuki Fedlak. And it says that he was cut from his mother's womb after she died as a result of deliberate drowning during the later stages of pregnancy. So some researchers have suggested that this is an indication that caesareans were being practiced. But, the story talks about a posthumous caesarean. And it's possibly more connected to accounts that we would have for the continent in medieval times. And these sort of talk about a practice called sectua in mortua. And basically this was tied into concern for the fate of the baby's soul. So they wanted to deliver the baby even if the mother had died, to give the unbaptized infant a chance of being baptized. So there's all these sort of factors that could potentially be contributing to, this underrepresentation of maternal deaths in our sites. At Ranelagh then, just two examples that we had. We had two pregnant women and their unborn babies. Now, in the modern world, maternal deaths in places like sub-Sahara Africa, they would occur because of things like hemorrhaging, hypertensive disorders and eclampsia, infection, obstructed labour and unsafe abortions. So these are probably the same sorts of things that would have affected women in the past. So at Ranelagh are two cases. We have here, you can see a young mother, so she was only about 17 to 22 years. The baby was probably about 38 weeks gestation, and again the head is lying downwards in the pelvis, so the baby was probably ready to be born. So here you can see it a little bit closer. Little fetal individuals are they're very delicate, so it takes really good kind of preservation conditions and very meticulous excavation, for them to be found and for their position to be reconstructed. Here's another young adult mother, and again we've got a baby with the head down, probably measuring about 38 weeks, so potentially full term. Now, DNA was undertaken on this pair, and it was able to determine that the baby was male. So that kind of, again, when we use DNA to determine the sex of children, it can give us another layer of sort of personhood, because quite often our studies of children in the past are, genderless, because we can't, by looking at the bones, we can't say if we're dealing with a little boy or a little girl. This individual over to the left, she was particularly interesting because she was buried over in one of the ditches at Ranelagh, and you can see that her arms are quite sort of, flayed out to one side over here. And you can see as well that her rib cage, it looks like she's sort of slumped. So she seems to have been buried in a grave in the base of the ditch when the ditch was still open. And this is what we would suggest is a casual burial. So it's possible that she was kind of a bit of an outcast for some reason, a social outcast. Now, there's no kind of apparent reason in her skeleton. There's no evidence of disease that might account for this. But maybe the paternity of her baby was problematic in her society, or maybe she had some sort of invisible condition that we can't see today. But so normally pregnant women are just in the cemeteries along with anybody else, but she was an anomaly in this respect. At Ranelagh as well, then we had a lot of preterms and neonatal babies. So we had 12 preterm infants who'd all died during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So again, this would be kind of one of the more high risk times for modern babies. So that's potentially, mirroring what happens biologically. The youngest preterm baby had died at about 7 months gestation. And then we had 34 full-term neonatal babies, and the fact that they weren't associated with an adult female, maybe the mother survived, or maybe there had been some sort of caesarean practices to separate the babies. There were 2 sets of twins who'd been buried on their own. Now, it's quite tricky to see these, so there's a little rib cage of one and the little legs, so that's one baby there. And then over here, there's a little skull, but it's a much more poorly preserved. So those 2 were both buried alongside one another, were of similar kind of age in terms of gestational weeks. So we can suggest that they were twins, but without DNA, we can't be 100% certain. Now, this little pair, you can see there's two sets of legs, and this really caused my team to, sort of pulled at the heartstrings, because there was a bit of skull here, and whenever that was lifted and they were able to look at the images, you can see that the hands are very much sort of overlapped or even entwined. So again, I think it can be very difficult to sort of think about these and to imagine, the suffering, of the mothers and the families that lost these children. But at the same time, I think that's an important story for us to tell, because sometimes we tend to kind of almost turn people in the past into robots and forget about things like emotion. And whenever we find very careful placement of bodies in the graves, then that gives us, a whole insight of sort of reverence and care being shown towards the dead. So, just the positioning of these little hands is, to me, very significant and very important. If we sort of look more generally then at funerary practices, what were they doing to their dead? So I've looked in quite a lot of depth at the Ballyhanna children and how they were being laid out in their graves. And quite a lot, so almost a quarter of them would display some sort of level of atypical burial practices, that deviate from what we'd expect from a Christian burial. So you can see here we've got a child in this sort of extended supine position, just that we're familiar today with, with modern sort of Christian burials. But then sometimes you find, arms in different positions, and quite frequently you find very young children and babies being buried with flexed legs, so usually flexed at the hips and the knees, and their arms in a variety of different positions. So you can see, there's quite obvious flexing. This little baby had their knees pulled up quite high in front of their pelvis. And because I've seen this as well at Ranelagh, and the more I see it, the more I think it's actually trying to mirror sleeping positions, because today our burial practices are very formal, and there's usually, a religious person would oversee. But in medieval times, it would be more the family that would have been burying their dead. And a lot of women would have been involved in preparing a body for burial. And you do find things like sort of mundane objects, like little bits of pottery, slag, metal, beads in burials. In one of the burials at Ballyhanna, we even found like a prehistoric flint arrowhead in a skeleton's hand. So I think, these are things that have been sort of overlooked, but more and more work, in England and Ireland has suggested that people were deliberately positioning the burials in a particular way to make them maybe look like they were sleeping, and also then adding kind of protective charms or apotropaic devices into the burials. And we even get things like pillow stones. So again, that kind of could be the idea of sort of sleeping. And sometimes in burials you get kind of ashy layers, and it's thought that maybe these are connected to the domestic environment and sort of to the hearth and to the family. So regardless, I think again we're seeing kind of care and tenderness in burials, and in particular when they're dealing with young children. At Ballyhannah, a lot of the burials were associated with quartz. So you can see these little white pebbles. And again, there seemed to be a particular positioning around the head and at the hands. And at Ranelagh as well, an awful lot of bodies were associated with quartz. And if you even think about modern burial practices, if you go to a cemetery, quite often it's shiny stones and quartz and sparkly material on burials. So this is something that we find from prehistoric times all the way through to modern day. And some people would suggest that it's maybe to do with sort of purity and, a sort of a symbol of purity. So at Ranelagh then, this is just, we had almost, I suppose, over 80% of people were being buried in a sort of a typical Christian manner. So this is just to show you an example. So the head would be to the west, so it's sort of facing the east for the resurrection and judgment day. And then the body is extended and it's supine, lying on its back. But we did find again some deviations at Ranelagh. So for example, this is a teenager, so she was an adolescent female. And she suffered from chronic tuberculosis. But you can see, her hands are clasped up in front of her face, like she's praying. And you can see her feet are sort of pulled up with her heels against her buttocks. Now, at Ranelagh, I kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of times they were trying to mirror religious practices, because we had, I think it was 3 people who were buried face down in a prone position. And in all 3 cases, their arms were like this. And this is called the Oran's position. And it would have been a very early kind of sort of penitential position, where people would lie face down on the ground in a prostrate position, and then their hands in the Oran's. And I think they're trying to kind of replicate that in the graves as well. And then the very sort of tightly flexed position could potentially be trying to replicate kneeling. So in the older children and in adults. Here's just an older child with flexed legs. And sometimes you get bits of grave furniture. So these are what we'd call earmuff stones. So it's when you get stones at either side of a skull, and people think it was just really to keep the skull in its position so it's facing the right way. But I just wanted to include this example because, even little infants would get this kind of quite formal burial treatment. And at some sites, instead of using stones, they would actually put a skull at either side. So these would have been, maybe ancestors who'd been disturbed by later burials, and the remains maybe were pushed to one side, but then they reused the skulls as earmuff stones. So at Ranelagh then, there's this notion that Christian burials don't tend to have grave goods, but, at Ballyhannah, we had definitely got sort of mundane objects that were being quite carefully positioned around the bodies. And at Ranelagh, we had 41% of burials had at least one grave good. So, like I said, quartz pebbles were the most common, so that's about 23%. And you can see then there were things like, so there's quartz at the knee of that little child. This little girl, again, we had DNA undertaken on her, so she was 3.5 to 4.5, but she had this lovely bone pin. And here you can see a 9.5 to 10 to 11.5-year-old child, and they were buried with an iron blade and a stone artifact. Now, my colleague Cormac McSparran, he did a sort of a statistical analysis of the types of grave goods and how much energy would have been needed to create them. And he came to the conclusion that older children and adolescents seemed to be getting buried with more prestigious items that would have taken more effort to make, whereas adults were being buried with more sort of functional items. And then the very young children, it was mostly quartz. So even though these people would have been living in quite a hierarchical society, he came to the conclusion that rather than trying to display status through burials, they were trying to express emotional loss and lost reproductive and labour potential. And that's why he thought that resources were mostly being expended on the burials of older children and adolescents, because you know, those would have been those children would have been, you know, their parents would have been relying on them to provide for them in their old age. So they probably felt that loss particularly keenly. So we also then find double burials, and these again these are quite unusual. So these would be a minority burial practice or an atypical burial practice. And I set out on a project a few years ago to try to again review the evidence across medieval Ireland, because I was trying to look for evidence of grandparents and children in the past. The project sort of came from my mother told me about a funeral that her sister had been at, when a grandfather and his daughter's little miscarried baby had been buried together in the same coffin. So I kind of thought, you know, we get these double burials in the past. Could we be potentially finding relatives like that? So I looked at 23 burial grounds, and I found 43 simultaneous burials. So these double burials are when two people would have died around the same time in a community, and then for whatever reason they chose to bury them together. So we might assume that they're, you know, relatives and they're closely related, but we can't always be definite about that without DNA. Now, like I said, it's a very minority practice, so that was 43 burials out of 5,095, so it's only 0.8%. So this graph just shows you the profile. So this is the adults only. Now, interestingly, there were no paired burials of a man and a woman, you know, which is kind of what we would expect today. But a lot of like Gaelic women could choose to be buried with their parents, so that's possibly one of the reasons you don't get kind of married couples. And it was mostly pairs of men. With the children, there was a wide variety of different ages, and then the majority were adults and sort of older adults and children. So this large group. So it could be like a man and a teenager, or a middle-aged or older man, woman with child. So these are the ones who potentially could be grandparents. But like I say, a study that I would like to see done in the future is some DNA work. So just in terms of the mostly two men, I think a lot of these ended up dying violently, and maybe they were sort of comrades in arms, and that's why they were buried together. So this is one example from Luskin, County Dublin. So you've got two adult males who both had been decapitated and had other evidence of weapon trauma. So we know they died violently, but you can see that they're holding hands. So whether that was because they didn't have heads and to sort of look after each other in the afterlife, or maybe that was just a normal thing in the past, because we kind of, I suppose the lens that we look at relationships is quite often coloured by Victorian values, and this is pre that, so we have to kind of step out of the Victorian way of thinking. So maybe holding hands for men was a perfectly normal thing in medieval society. Here you've got two little children from Parknahown in County Laois, and again you can see they've got little earmuff stones. And then this is just an example of a middle-aged sort of female and a 7-year-old. And you can see that they're kind of looking towards each other, and it's quite an intimate burial arrangement. Now, middle-aged would be 35 to 50, so we think of that as very young, but in the past that was actually a very good age to get to. You know, most of the people we look at, like at Ballyhanna, most people were dying before they reached 35. You know, it was mostly young adults. So that potentially could be a grandmother-child pair. This is another site, Stacumney in County Kildare, and when I saw the photograph of this pair, I assumed we were going to be dealing with a mother and a little newborn baby. And you can see they're very compressed. The adult male is very compressed, so that tells us that he was buried within a shroud. Or I've given it away. The person was buried within a shroud, and the sex determination was actually, it was an adult male. So you've got an adult male with a little newborn, and they were both wrapped together in the same shroud. So again, potentially a grandfather or a father and a child, but DNA would be needed to sort of verify that. But I suppose I'm just including this example to sort of highlight that not all pairs with babies are female, and they're not always the mother. So it's just something we have to be sort of careful about. Now, at Ranelagh, we had two double burials, and these were both extremely poignant. So We have here, you can see, this is what the little skeletons look like in the ground. And then this is my colleague Libby Mulqueeny, who's a really talented artist in Queen's University. This is her reconstruction. So we had a little boy of 2.5 to 3 years to the left, and then a little girl of 7.5 to 9.5 years. Now, the ancient DNA work that Dr. Lara Cassidy and her team in Trinity College Dublin, basically, to me, again, it brought a whole new layer of information about these people and really helped to personalize them. So she was able to tell us that the little boy had blue eyes and light brown hair, and the little girl had brown eyes and light brown hair. So you're moving so far from thinking of them as two little skeletons to two children. She also was able to say that they were probably first cousins once removed, but they weren't related to any of the other individuals who had had DNA work undertaken on them at Ranelagh. Whenever she mapped the DNA profiles of the two children onto kind of modern populations, the little boy, his DNA was similar to modern Irish, so he could well have been local to Ranelagh. But the little girl, she was more similar to modern Scottish or Welsh kind of genetics. So the interpretation for this was that maybe she had one Irish and one British parent. So again, that's kind of given us insights about potential migration and, you know, how communities sort of evolved and interacted, you know, with newcomers. I just wanted to highlight as well, I mean, you can see from the reconstruction that they're buried almost in a hugging position. And whenever they were excavating the skeletons, you know, so the little girl's skull has been removed here, but you can see that her right arm, goes right in behind the little boy's neck, and then there's her hand. So she was really, you know, embracing him. And I kind of like the idea that maybe she'd been charged with looking after the younger child, you know, in the afterlife. So then there was another burial. Now, I've heard that on the excavation, people were calling this pair Romeo and Juliet. But whenever we did our osteological analysis, it was actually Romeo and Romeo. So there were two males. So there was skeleton 63 was a young adult male. The DNA wasn't particularly well preserved, so couldn't find out anything more about them. And then the other individual was an adolescent male, and he had brown eyes and dark brown hair. The DNA showed that they were third-degree relatives, so that's first cousins. So you can see from the way they're buried that it's a very intimate sort of position. So these two must have been very close in life, and then that was sort of being replicated in their burial positioning. So were they foster brothers? You know, we get accounts in the early law tracts that talks about foster brother of the same blanket and of the same cup and of the same bed. You know, so these relationships could be extremely close. You know, were they gay? You know, again, sort of this is what I'm saying about our Victorian values. You know, whenever you look at the kind of early medieval tracts, you know, it seems like homosexuality was reasonably well accepted, and it was sort of the church, when it came in, it was the one started imposing kind of limitations and you know, causing people to have penitence and different things. But you get the sense that, you know, maybe they were trying to impose their views on a sort of relatively pagan population who had their own way of living and doing things. So it was the church was trying to sort of, you know, impose sort of rulings and regulations. So we don't know. We can't say that. Maybe they were just very, very close. But you can see from the position of the arms here that they really were fully embracing. And the guy on the right side, you know, his hands were actually touching the head, so the hair of the other individual. So it's a very, again, kind of a poignant burial. Okay, so that's a bit about sort of burial practices. Just want to move on now to look at kind of osteological indicators. Now, today, for survival, you know, a lot of us, we can just nip out to the shops, go to Tesco's, buy what we need, and we're happy, you know, get all the food stuff we need. These guys would have had to go out and basically procure everything they needed. So they'd have had to grow all their own crops, you know, plant the seeds, tend the plants, then harvest them, make them into bread, make them into soups, whatever. They'd have had to look after all their own animals, you know, and raise them and feed them, and again, you know, butcher them and get the meat and all the different dairy products and secondary products. Anything they wanted to make, they had to do it themselves. So all their furniture, you know, any bridges or any houses, anything like that. So they had a very arduous physical existence, and we find evidence of this then reflected in their skeletons. So we would get lots of degenerative joint disease. That's basically arthritis. So I've just got a few examples here. So you can see here, this is a finger where the bones have fused together. Here you've got sort of wrist bones, and again there's sort of polishing, so that's the cartilage is broken down, and it's basically arthritis of the hands. And quite a lot of the women at Ranelagh would have had sort of arthritis in their hands, and this could have been tied into sort of domestic chores, maybe making clothes, maybe making food, doing the sorts of kind of domestic chores, because again the law tracts tell us that there was a very gendered division of labour, and that women would have stayed around the homestead, whereas men were more likely to go out into the fields or go further from home. So almost all the adults at Ranelagh had osteoarthritis in some part of their body, and this also included young adults, so that gives us an indicator that this arduous existence happened from young age. So you can see here we've got what's called Schmorl's nodes, so these kind of depressions in the vertebral bodies, so as parts of the spine, and it's basically when the disc has kind of burst and kind of caused these then indentations in the bones. And it's very common in archaeological populations, and it's usually due to sort of stress and strain on the spine. This is a humerus, so an upper arm bone, and it's got kind of lipping on it, so that's one of the ways we can identify osteoarthritis. And then here's a vertebrae, and you can see that's what the surface should look like, nice and smooth, but then this one's all kind of pitted and eroded. So again, so lots of just indicators of kind of wear and tear and stress and strain on skeletons. Now, these farming people, they would have also then been very susceptible to injuries, just as they went about sort of their daily life. And about 22% of the Ranelagh people displayed minor injuries. So things like, fractured ribs, maybe a depressed fracture on the skull, things like that. But we also then had 2 quite serious hip fractures. And, sometimes again, we sort of underestimate people in the past, and we don't think about, their ability to sort of treat major injuries. But at Ranelagh, both of these individuals had survived for quite a length of time. So this example here is from an older adult male, and he had a long-standing hip fracture. So basically part of his femoral head had sort of detached and fused then to his hip. So this should be like a nice rounded sort of cup shape, but you can see it's all kind of gnarled and kind of pitted and stuff. So that's related to this kind of fracture of the femoral head, and there's the bit that broke off the femoral head and then attached itself to the pelvis. He also had a fractured lower leg bone, so what might have happened to him was that he suffered from a heavy fall. So maybe he fell off a building, or maybe he fell off a horse or a wagon or something like that. Over here then we've got a different type of hip fracture. So this time it's an older adult female. Again, it's a long-standing fracture, but the femoral head has basically broken off the rest of the femur. And there's also a lot of osteoarthritis, and there's bits of polishing. So that tells us that even after she'd had that serious injury, she still kind of put weight on the leg and she still used it. So this is quite a characteristic fracture of type 2 osteoporosis. And because it's an older female, that's possibly what happened. But her leg probably would have been quite unstable, but she still tried to use it, and she probably had to for survival. This is an individual from Ballyhanna who had a very serious traumatic injury. So you can see him here in his grave, and you can see that the left leg is in a slightly odd position, sort of raised up a little bit. So this is an example where we've tried to sort of undertake a bioarchaeology of care study. So he had a fracture dislocation at his left hip joint. And basically the femoral head has kind of moved out of the acetabulum, which is the hip joint, and it's kind of burst through. There's like a hole in the pelvis, the obturator foramen. So he would have had this kind of long-standing injury, and it resulted then in his leg being in a permanently flexed position at the hip and at the knee. So for him to move around, he'd have had to, have some sort of crutches to support him. Now, if you think about an injury like this, so it's a long-term physical impairment, but we've been trying to reconstruct, what was it like for that man when this injury happened? He probably, again, it would have been like, this is sort of injury that modern people get in car crashes. So again, it was a high impact high force situation that caused the injury. So was he thrown from a horse, or did he fall off a wagon? Something serious happened. So he probably would have had to be stretchered back to his home. He'd probably been in a huge amount of pain, and he probably would have been bedridden for a minimum of 3 months while the fracture was healing. So if you imagine the amount of care that he would have needed then to survive, you know, he'd have had people having to bring him his food, his water, address his toileting needs, prevent him getting bed sores, you know, and prevent him getting, you know, respiratory complications, you know, bowel obstructions and different things, you know, all the sorts of secondary complications that can result from being bedridden for a long period of time. But he survived, and eventually, you know, he must have regained, you know, some sort of a normal life. Now, he wouldn't have been able to go out into the fields. He wouldn't have been able to run after large animals or do the things that sort of adult males would typically have done in medieval society. But presumably they would have found a role for him, and, you know, but presumably he must have been well enough thought of by the community to have been looked after to this level. Just this is another example of potential kind of medical intervention. So this is a procedure called trepanation that we find quite a lot of cases in the archaeological record, you know, even dating back to sort of Mesolithic times all the way through to probably 19th century. So trepanation basically involves removing a roundel of skull. Now, it's thought, I mean, it even happens today for people who've maybe got like a bleeding beneath the skull and they want to alleviate the pressure. So in the past, you know, from the sort of medieval texts, we get a sense that even if people had something like epilepsy, they would try to, you know, release what they thought were the demons from the skull, and that's why they'd undertake a trepanation. Or if people, even if they were hearing voices, or if they had muffled sound, or they would basically try it for a lot of different sort of procedures. So this example here was a young woman, so she was 18 to 35. She was one of the earliest skeletons that we dated at Ballyhanna, so she was 7th to 8th century, and you can see that she has a large trepanation at the top of her skull. The edges are all kind of jagged, so that tells us that she had survived the operation for quite a considerable period of time, and quite a lot of people in the past did survive. Now, she also had chronic osteomyelitis, so that's like a bone infection of her left femur, so her thigh bone, and also then some of her vertebrae. So we don't know whether she had this infection in her system and they decided to treat it with the trepanation, or if the trepanation introduced the infection into her body and then caused the infection in her leg. Now, we've got quite a lot of information about, you know, Gaelic doctors and sort of the herbs they would have used, and we know that going to a holy well would have been another way to sort of treat different ailments. And there were at least 106 holy wells in Donegal, and about 8 of these would have been in the vicinity of Ballyshannon, and there was one probably only about a mile away from the Ballyhanna site. So again, you can kind of imagine that they might have tried to, you know, use the curative properties, or the believed curative properties of a holy well to try to treat people with serious injuries and illnesses. At Ballyhanna then, you know, I mean, today one of our big killers is cancer. You know, that's what I mean, Jerry, you know all about that. We don't find too many cases of cancers in the past, and that's generally because, well, we think it's because people didn't live as long. People weren't maybe exposed to the same sort of, you know, toxins and things that we are today. But I just thought I would include this example to show you. This is one case from Ballyhanna where we think we might have a metastatic carcinoma. So we had a young adult female, and you can see she has all these kind of what we call lytic, or basically erosive lesions in her skull. Only her skull was preserved, so we can't tell what was going on in the rest of her body. Whenever you get lytic lesions like this, it's mostly associated with a primary tumour of the breast or possibly the lung. So what we think might be happening here is that these are secondaries associated with breast cancer, although, you know, we do have to think about sort of differential diagnosis. So again, you know, she would have been a very ill person, and possibly, you know, whenever her symptoms started, she was, you know, potentially only going to live for another, you know, 3 years or so. But, you know, before she died, she would have been very ill. So I just wanted to show you that example. At Ballyhanna, we also then had 2 men with quite a rare genetic disease. It's actually officially classified as a rare disease, multiple osteochondromas, or sometimes it's called diaphyseal achalasia. So these are the skeletons of the 2 men. It's a genetic disorder, and basically it's also colloquially called bumpy bone disease because that's what happens. You get all these different types of growths on the bones. It's incredibly rare. So for modern kind of white populations, about 0.9 to 2 people per 100,000. In societies where there's kind of more restrictions, so like the Chamorros of Guam, there's 100 per 100,000. And then in Manitoba in Canada, you've got a very high rate of 1,310 per 100,000. And we have 4 archaeological cases in Ireland. And I think that's something to do with our island status. So it causes a range of orthopedic deformities like short stature. You get sort of limb length discrepancies. You get deformities in the forearms, problems with the hips and the knees and the ankles. So, you know, as well as kind of all these sort of bumps on the bones. And the bumps on the bones can then kind of cause damage to nerves or blood vessels if they pinch them. And sometimes they can even turn cancerous. So you can see skeleton 331 was more severely affected than skeleton 197. And these are just some of the kind of bumps on their bones. So again, Lara and her team and her PhD student, Isolt Jackson, they've looked at the genetics of these 2 cases. And they've actually found that it's 2 completely separate strains, which is pretty amazing. Our first kind of hint that this was the case was when we realised that these 2 individuals had probably lived a couple of 100 years apart, but we still assumed that they were going to be relatives and that this was a condition in the family. But this new DNA work, which is just kind of hot off the press, has shown that there was no connection between them. So that's kind of added another sort of layer of mystery to why we might have 2 cases in one cemetery. At Ranelagh then, we also had lots of cases of tuberculosis, and tuberculosis would have been one of the big infectious diseases that affected medieval people, you know, and I mean, even people up to the 19th century, and even today, it's still a problem. But at Ranelagh, we had 5 children and 3 adults, so it's about 2.5%, as opposed to about the 1% that we would normally find. Now, we might think that's really low, it's not that big a problem, but we only see bone lesions in a very small proportion of cases, so this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So this is an adolescent, skeleton 291, an adolescent female. So you can see this is her in her grave, and then you can see these big sort of, again, erosive lesions. So she had lesions at her elbow and then in her ribs. This is the skeleton I talked about earlier, the young woman with you know, her hands in front of her face. She had these massive lesions in her lower legs, and her whole body was just riddled with kind of erosive lesions, even her face. So again, she would have been very ill and probably needed long-term care. She'd have had the chronic form of the disease. And the fact that she would have had facial disfigurements, again, is something to think about, because you can imagine, you know, like a young woman with facial disfigurements, there probably would have been a lot of, you know, psychological trauma as well. And then this is another young adult female, and you can see she's got collapsed vertebrae, which are very classic of tuberculosis, and she's got then these kind of lytic lesions in her pelvis. So we've been trying to get pathogen DNA from these individuals, but it's been proving very difficult. And my colleague Mike Taylor over in the University of Surrey, he's been working very hard to try to develop new techniques, because we haven't managed to get any sort of cases of tuberculosis and their genetics analysed from Ireland. But he thinks he's got one case that has potentially shown it's the human-to-human form of the disease as opposed to the zoonosis and being spread from animals. Okay, so I'm sort of on to my last bit now. So I wanted to talk about weapon trauma. So we've kind of looked a bit about diseases, but I wanted to now look at violence. So at Ranelagh, we had 6 cases of weapon trauma. So these were in 5 adults and 1 child, and they were all male. They were the sort of typical profile in terms of the adults, you know, that there were males sort of in the prime of their lives who may have been warriors, you know, so there were young adults and middle-aged adults. They were all robust. So you can imagine, you know, they're big, strong kind of warriors. Now, 5 of these individuals had been decapitated. So the decapitation kind of suggests that they had a sort of a formal execution, because you can see this is one individual, skeleton 290. So you can see these are his upper 2 most vertebrae, and you can see the clear sort of chops through them. But you can also see that the back of the mandible has been clipped, so that tells us that the head would have been what we say is hyperflexed at the neck, so bent forward, very extremely and then chopped from behind, and that's how it clipped then the angle of the mandibles, the angles of the mandible. What's quite interesting about this individual is you can see that they've been able to retrieve his body, and they've tried to put his skull back into alignment with the rest of the body, but they've got it slightly skewed. So you can see that they use the earmuff stones to try to sort of hold it in the right position, but there's where the neck are and there's where his skull is. So we had one individual who was buried with no skull, and you can see it's quite close to the top of the grave pit, so there wouldn't have been room for the head to be added, so it wasn't present. So presumably this had been kept as some sort of a trophy, because, you know, again, from the sort of historical accounts, you know, we know that there was a cult of the head and that the head was kind of valued as a trophy. And he also had cut marks then on his neck, the front of his neck vertebrae, so it's possible he had his throat cut as well. So this is what I mean, you know, we can get very kind of graphic evidence about, you know, violence in the past, and it doesn't really paint this in any sort of niceties, you know, whereas the historical sources will tend to sort of focus on, you know, the great and the good and propaganda. Whenever we look at the skeletons, we can see really what these weapons were doing to bodies and how these men would have died. So this individual here, he had these sort of quite strange sort of slice marks on the back of his skull. And this was something then that seemed to have been repeated. So this is just another example. You can see again, you've got the same kind of cuts and slices on the back of the skull. And what I think was actually happening was that they were deliberately targeting pieces of hair. So almost like trying to, you know, take off a piece of a ponytail or something. And we've got again sort of accounts in the different historical sources. You know, there's accounts in the Ulster cycle that tell us at length, you know, the styles of hair of the different warriors. So they could have, you know, hair length of different lengths. It could be hanging, plaited, could be wound around the back of the head. You know, so they put a lot of emphasis on their hair. We've also then got sort of legal texts which talk about offences that could be caused in relation to the hair. So the Book of Achill, it says that if half of his head or the whole of his head has been cut off a person, half the body fine and half compensation and full honour price should be paid for it. So, you know, again, in other European countries, we know that people were deliberately sort of tonsured as a way of sort of disqualifying them from kinship and as a way of humiliating them. So I think that at Ranelagh, you know, these two individuals and another individual, this was a very deliberate thing, and they were trying to kind of humiliate them, and maybe these guys were of high status and they were trying to sort of, you know, prevent their sort of their status and kind of taking it away from them by cutting off their hair. So it was basically like a scalping, but just very much concentrated at the back of the head. And we've got sort of other sites like Lagore Cranog, which would have been a royal site, where you've got concentrations of occipitals, which is basically the back of the skull bone. So I think this is something that it hasn't been maybe widespread identified, but I think it's probably a more common phenomenon than we might think in these early medieval populations. Now, this individual here, skeleton 242, you can see his burial looks a bit odd. So there's sort of some bones are out of place, and his skull is over on his right rib cage. So what actually seems to have happened with him was that he was decapitated. He died in a particularly vicious attack, and there was lots of kind of hack marks. So you can see like this sort of cut here on one of his legs, and then there was his arm had been sort of cut through. So all this happened to him before he died. Then they seem to have retrieved his body, put it onto some sort of a pyre, and we found lots of evidence of burning on his remains. So presumably this could have been some sort of a ritual activity, or it could have been just simply a pyre on some sort of a battle site. We don't know. But then presumably his community were able to get his body, and he seems to have been wrapped in a shroud, and that's what kept, you know, this is a sort of a separated hand and the skull, and that's what kept them in position. So then he was sort of taken and put into the community burial ground at Ranelagh. So we also then had another individual who seemed to have had, you know, a lot of things done to him. So he'd been decapitated, and then there were lots of little cut marks all across his chest and hips, and there was a cut mark on his left ankle. So this seems to be, you know, due to some sort of, they seem to have been trying to access his heart and his lungs. and possibly even his genitals. Now, because he also showed signs of decapitation, and because he died violently, we must assume that these were some sort of, again, mutilation practices, as opposed to, honouring him by burying different parts of his body in different places, which is something that we know kind of would have happened amongst high status families in later medieval times. And this level of violence, I mean, he had probably about 30 different cut marks all across his body. This is something we find in other Irish sites. So we've got a middle-aged man from a site called Owenbreasty in County Galway. He had 127 cut marks, and he seemed to have been kind of segmented after death and then kind of buried in a bundle. Another man from County Louth, he again had similar pattern of cuts. And again, they thought the interpretation is that they were trying to, take out his internal organs and disembowel him. So this isn't, it isn't a regular finding, but it has parallels in other kind of other sites. Now, Dr. Johnny Geber, he looked at the Owenbreasty skeletons, and he came to the conclusion that maybe this was sort of like a socially sanctioned violence. Maybe it was particularly sort of frenzied because it was like a vengeance killing, and that there was maybe like a public mutilation aspect to it. So it's very, it's very grim. But the fact that we sort of find these individuals in different sites, it does seem to be something that was, happening on a recurrent basis for whatever reason. This individual here, so again, we've got your sort of classic decapitation, and we've got damage to the back of the mandible. So again, it's the hyperflex neck. But what was interesting about him was that he had these sort of sword cuts or knife cuts on the front of his mandible, so his chin area. And given the fact that we had this focus on hair at the back of the skull, I think what was going on here was maybe they were removing his beard. Now, this isn't, we've also then got historical evidence which kind of talks about beards, and again, they seem to have been very important. So again, in the Irish sagas, warriors talk about, the length of their beards could be forked, and it seems to have been almost like a social marker that you couldn't be like a full warrior unless you'd had a beard, and your beard was particularly coiffured. And we've got sort of, again, legal tracts which talk about offences, and they say the offences could be caused to the beard or whiskers of men, and indeed the holding of the cut beard of one's opponent after battle was recorded in some poems celebrating the victory of a king. So that's I think is a possible interpretation for this individual. And I just included these two guys here, so you can see they've got quite different beards, and this one's it's got the split in the middle. So these would be this is kind of depictions of kind of late medieval Gaelic warriors. So then the last case I'm going to talk about is the decapitated child. Now again, this was another one that caused my team quite a lot of shock, because this was like a young child, so only 7.5 to 9.5 years. And again, you can see kind of the pattern of decapitation, on their vertebrae and then on their mandible. So DNA was undertaken, and it showed that it was a little boy. So the cut marks, it wasn't just like a clean cut, there were multiple cuts, and they were made with quite a fine object, so probably more like a knife. So this individual, you can see he's been buried in an extended supine manner. He's quite near this pit, which we still haven't quite figured out if there's any sort of significance. But he also had a number of grave goods in with him. So he had like a lignite bracelet and a few other sort of bits and pieces. So it looked like he was given a careful burial presumably by his community and his family. Now, one interesting thing was this large stone that's positioned across his chest. So sometimes in atypical burials, or what we call deviant burials, there's a clear attempts have been made to kind of pin a corpse down into the grave. And sometimes they would use things like, large stones, or they would disable the body, or sometimes they would bury it face down in a prone position, although there's other interpretations for prone burials. But it's possible that because this child died violently and they were young, that maybe there was a concern, that they would be an angry ghost, and that they would be restless, and that they needed to be kept in their grave so that they wouldn't come back and harm the living. So that's a possibility. Now, why did they actually, feel the need to decapitate, a young child? Well, maybe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were caught up in some sort of a raid. But the fact that the decapitation looks like a formal execution, makes me think that that's not quite likely. if we look at the early Irish laws again, you know, we look at, there's a lot of things like honour price. So causing the injury or death to a child, regardless of their status, was considered to be a very serious crime. So there would have been serious penalties. And because this child was older than 7 years, his honour price would have been half that of his father. So basically, if the person who perpetrated the action couldn't repay the family, you know, they themselves could be killed, or they could be sold into slavery. Now, the annals, they also talk about hostages, and this seems to have been quite something, especially amongst the upper classes, that happened quite regularly. So it was a means of kind of maintaining sort of political authority, and kings, for example, would have taken hostages just as a way of kind of securing territory and securing their rights and their sovereignty over territory. Now, the historical sources again kind of talk about cases where hostage situations went wrong, and if loyalty was shown, the hostage was well treated. But if anything happened that sort of they were going against the ruler, then the hostage, basically their status changed to being a prisoner, and they could be blinded, or they could be killed, or they could be ransomed. So I think possibly what we're dealing with here is maybe a hostage, that the child was a hostage, and we do get, you know, accounts of sons being taken as hostage. So that's one possible interpretation for that individual. Now, we do get quite a lot of teenagers, you know, presumably quite often boys, with evidence of violent deaths in medieval Ireland. But again, the sort of historical accounts indicate that adulthood was attained at about the age of 14. So in a way, it's not really unexpected to get these teenage boys with violent death. But in terms of Ireland, there's only 3 children who have younger than 14 who had died violently, and in all of those cases, they were part of mass burials at castle sites. So they were probably just caught up in battles and died, you know, along with the rest of their families, and were buried. So this is quite a unique burial. So it's particularly horrible, but it's you know, it's very interesting in terms of, you know, again, kind of giving light to some of the things that are written in the historical sources. So hopefully that's just a quick sort of run through, you know, the potential of osteoarchaeology for kind of, you know, moving from, you know, a dead body, you know, to trying to sort of recreate these people as they were when they were alive. And I just need to say, you know, that this isn't all my own work. You know, these projects are big team efforts and involve, you know, numerous individuals, and I think they're quite nice examples that show, you know, how when government agencies and commercial sector archaeologists come together with academic archaeologists, that we can get a really rich picture, you know, of the people who lived in the past. So hopefully you find that interesting.